Hello, everybody. You're here for Dust Collection 101. We're about to dive into the essentials of dust collection in breweries and distilleries, including when it's needed, how to implement it, and the latest advancements in the field. We'll cover common questions about benefits, implementation options, and the maintenance, while also exploring new dust collection models recently introduced by ABM Equipment. I'm joined today by Alex Zielinski of ABM Equipment. Alex, what's going on? How's your day going?
Great. No, it's going great. How about you?
I can't complain. It's a sunny day here in Virginia. I can look outside and see it, but I'm happy to be chatting, dust collection here with you. So tell us a little bit more about ABM and what you all do in the industry.
Yeah, ABM Equipment provides different grain handling solutions for smaller and larger breweries. And we also pair that with scaling and automation. And so we go from bulk storage, grain delivery, through milling, through the grist, basically all the way to the mash tun. And then that's kind of where we hand it off to the mash tun and the cookers. But with that included, we do bag dump stations, mills, bulk bag unloaders, basically anything you need to convey the grain from the truck to the mash tun.
Awesome. And you've told me you've been with the company 6.5 years. So I'm curious, what do you like best about what you do?
I think the different challenges. I've done lots and lots of breweries at this point, but there's always different challenges unique to the brewery, whether it's space limitations or how they want to convey the grain or how they want to do their recipe. So it's always a fun and exciting challenge, and I love helping them get able to start making more beer because drinking beer is great.
I couldn't agree more. So let's dive in. Alex, why is there this sudden push for dust collection?
Yeah, the sudden push is coming with the new NFPA standards. The NFPA, the National Fire Protection Agency, releases new standards every couple of years, and basically they become more and more stringent on milling grains that create dust particles in the air. And so, with that new push from the NFPA, it's causing the local jurisdictions to look more minutely at these milling processes. And so with that, having the dust collection allows the brewers to be able to mitigate that dust and eliminate the need for more F1 designated equipment, which requires explosion proof and adds cost really quickly.
Yeah, explosion proof sounds a little pricey, but you mentioned like the NFPA standards. Where can we find these?
Those are online. There's a lot of them. If you type in the NFPA standards, there's a link to different ones, and it has to do with the occupancy designation in different breweries. But ultimately, it's going to be up to local jurisdiction because every county has a different authority having jurisdiction, is what they call it. And so it's really their interpretation of the NFPA rules that matters the most. And so working with them is going to be their best bet to ensure that they have the right level of safety and dust collection necessary for their system.
And how often will a state or city require this?
So it really depends on the local jurisdiction. I've seen a lot more stringencies on the West Coast than the East Coast, and it kind of depends on the area that they're milling in. So if it's a really small, tight room, I've seen brewers do it in shipping containers kind of thing. So if it's really small volume of air where the dust concentration can get really high, that's when it becomes much more likely of a risk for an explosion to occur or whatnot. And so having the dust collection just eliminates that dust in the air and keeps things safe.
You mentioned preventing explosions, which I think we all want to do, but why else is dust collection important in breweries and distilleries?
Yeah, it's also important for just general housekeeping and cleanliness, and as well as operator safety. It's never great to be working in a brewery and just inhaling dust fumes all day long. So those are a couple other big ones. Also, especially if a brewery has a local restaurant and whatnot, I've seen breweries where they're doing the milling in the back and then the grain dust gets in the restaurant, and that's never what you want to see. So
Yeah,
and dust collection can be a great help there.
so that's not good for anybody. And as we kind of dive deeper into this, what are the best methods for controlling dust in a brewery so things like that don't happen?
Yeah, the best method is going to be dust collection, and so it's going to be adding a big filter, receiver, dust collector, and then adding different pickup points to where the grain is being transferred or milled, where that concentration of dust in the air is the highest. And so adding in a few pickup points there can really significantly eliminate the amount of dust in the air and just control the whole process much better.
Now, we talked a little bit earlier about, preventing explosions. So how do dust collectors help prevent fire and explosion hazards?
Yeah, so basically they eliminate the concentration of the dust in the air, and that's the biggest risk for explosions. It's just having that high concentration. It's kind of like you see those videos online where they're shooting cinnamon out of their mouth and then it just combusts. And so if it wouldn't be that dramatic, but if you had a high concentration and something sparked or whatnot, then you could have a potential explosion risk. And so adding the dust collection just eliminates that completely from the equation, just keeps everyone safe.
And as we see more conversations, Alex, about dust collection, can you talk to us a little bit about the types of dust collectors and which are best suited for the brewing industry?
Yeah, the standalone units are the best suited for the brewing industries. So typically, we'll take a grain handling system, whether it be a new one or an existing one, and then size up different pickup points where the dust concentration is the highest. And it's usually pretty obvious. The different like bag dump stations where they're dumping in grain, or anywhere the grain is transferring exposed to the environment, just creates that dust and lets it go. Same with the milling operation. And so those basically just standalone units are sized to where they only need to pick up exactly what you need. And that's the most cost savings as well. Instead of having a bigger system that's, doing more other parts of the building as well. So just keeping it small, keeping it concentrated to exactly what you need to pick up the dust from, and then you can save a lot of costs that way.
And I want to ask at this point in the conversation, because I know we're going to get into pretty good detail. If anyone has any follow-up questions for you or wants to reach out, what's the best way they can do so?
Yeah, contacting ABM Equipment would be the best way to do it. Yeah, we're always happy to help, and they just call our main office line. They'll get transferred to me. We're a small company, probably about 45, 50 employees, and so very much in touch with the rest of the company, and they'll forward the questions on to me, and more than happy to help.
Awesome. And it's abmequipment.com. And, let's go back to these dust collecting. Like, what are the difference between baghouse and cartridge filters for dust collection?
Yeah, so the biggest difference is the type of filter media inside of the dust collectors themselves. So cartridges are kind of like a pleated surface like you see in a shop vac, for instance. And then bag filters are more of a polyester smooth surface. And so they both have their places in the industry, but the cartridges are a little harder to clean, a little bit more expensive, but they can usually fit into tighter spaces. And so if there's not a lot of footprint available in the building or outside the building, not a lot of space to put a new dust collector, because typically they can get up to 10 to 15 feet, even a small one. And so if they don't have the room, then a cartridge filter is the best option. But if they do have more accessibility, more room, then going with the bag filter is much more economical in the long run. The bags are much cheaper than the cartridges, and they don't plug nearly as quickly because they don't have as much surface area for the dust to get hung up on, essentially. And so going with the bags, you can also you can wash them and reuse them and clean them as the filter gets dirtier and dirtier. So that's the most cost-effective option and what we tend to go with the most. But if the space is limited, then we go with the cartridges just to be able to install a new dust collector. And so it's really dependent on the individual customer's needs.
So, Alex, I know in my house, I've got 2 dogs who shed quite a bit, and I have a reminder of my phone for every 3 months to change the air filters. So, but when we're talking dust collection filters, like how often do they need to be cleaned or replaced?
Yeah, it depends on how often you're using them and how much grain you're dumping into them. On the dust collectors we install, where the filters are is kind of called the dirty air side. And then after the filters filter out the air and exhaust it back into the atmosphere, it's the clean air side. And so we install these little gauges on them that will actually measure the air pressure in the dirty and the clean side. And that difference is what tells you when those bags need to be changed. And so normal operation has them at 0 to 1 inches of water column. And then as you use them longer and longer, 6 months to a year, you'll see that water column start to go up to 2-3 inches. And once it reaches 3 to 4 inches, that's when you want to wash the bags or replace the bags. And then if you wash them, you can usually get like 3 or 4 life cycles out of them, which is pretty nice. And then eventually they'll get to the point where they become so caked in dust that washing them isn't effective. And so once you hit 6 inches of water column, the difference between the clean air and the dirty air pressures, that's when you know it's time to just completely replace the bags.
Now, talking like just overall maintenance, what are the requirements for a dust collection system?
Yeah, they're really low maintenance. The biggest one is going to be just monitoring that air pressure difference between the bags, and then changing the bags out when that becomes too high. So a lot of customers, what they like to do is just buy an extra set of bags, especially on the smaller units because they can range from 3 or 4 bags to 20, 30 bags, depending on the size of the system. And so if it's a small unit, they'll just keep an extra set, throw those in, wash the other ones, and then just kind of do that over and over until they become too plugged and they just replace them. But that's the only real maintenance required, is just changing and cleaning the bags and replacing them when necessary.
Well, thanks for sharing that. We had someone ask, is top loading really necessary?
Top loading is much cleaner. It's easier to access the bags and pull them out. The units get pretty tall, and so like 10 to 15 feet. And so on the bottom side of them is where all the dust falls. Basically, a lot of them have pulse jets. And so as the dust collector sucks in the dust, it'll catch in the bags, and then the jets will pulse. And then when they do that, it pulses the dust off the bags to keep them cleaner, and it falls down below through a rotary valve or airlock. And then they collect it in usually just a barrel until they dump it. So that underneath the bags is much dirtier and a little bit harder to access because you have to pull them from the top. And so when you can have top loading, when you have the room above it, then that's the easiest way for the operator to go in and change their bags. And that's really the only maintenance they need. So it's just keeping the operator in mind when designing the system.
No, that all definitely makes sense. So we're talking all these dust collection systems. How can you measure the efficiency?
The best way to do that is to have a dust hazard analysis done. And ABM doesn't do the dust hazard analysis, but we have other companies that we've worked with in the past and can help recommend to do that. But typically they'll go in and measure the air quality of the space as it's being used, and then give recommendations with and without the dust collector on.
Now, I think we have a question that every brewer will know the answer to. How can they reduce the amount of dust created during grain milling?
Yeah, and that's a great question. Yeah, the best way to do that is to use a properly designed system. And so, depending on the brewer, every brewer has different needs for whether it be how much they want to pull in, grain wise from different sources, how many different sources they want to have up, so depending on how many recipes they have. And so basically the best way to do that is to use equipment that's designed to move the grain in a way that creates the least amount of transfer between dust. So a lot of the systems that we use will keep the dust contained, whether it be in puck and chain conveyors or flex augers, and then transferring it from conveyors to other destinations by using flex hose, and just keeping all the dust contained in a closed system rather than like having a flex hose drop into an open mill without a lid is a good example. If they do that, then just the amount of dust created is substantially more than if the mill has a lid that's closed and everything's contained in the mill. And so basically the number one way to limit the amount of dust before the dust collector is just ensure you have a closed system and make those transfers as seamless as possible between the pickups and destinations.
Good stuff there. Now, breweries come in all shapes and sizes. Some are little, some are big, and often we have those overhead spaces or hard to reach areas. How do we prevent the dust from accumulating up there?
Yeah, the biggest thing with that is the dust collector is a great system. They need to be balanced, usually on startup. And so different amounts different sources will need different amounts of airflow. And so when we install a system, what we'll do is we'll have these small slide gates on each of the pickup points that you can adjust and then measure the air pressure as the dust collector is running. And then that way you limit the amount of suction from each pickup point to be exactly what it needs to be. You don't want to suck too much and take away good grain dust and good product, essentially. They make central vac units, which are more for picking up messes in breweries and whatnot. But the dust collector is just trying to mitigate the amount of dust in the air. And so balancing that properly is the best way for brewers to ensure that they don't have any, dust get into those overhead spaces and having to clean or, in the restaurant areas and whatnot.
So speaking of like locations, where exactly do you install the dust collection system in a brewery?
Yeah, it depends on the amount of space available for the brewery. The best location is outside, usually under a covered area, although they don't need to be. You can have them exposed to the elements. They'll hold up just fine. A lot of times brewers don't have the footprint or the luxury of having space outside that they can dedicate to a dust collector. And so we also put them inside of buildings as well. With that, putting them next to a wall is very important because basically the whole explosion mitigation risk, the only way to do that, or the most economic way to do that, is to use an explosion vent on the dust collector. And so what that is basically if an explosion were to ever occur and get to that dust collector, as soon as it travels through the duct and gets into that bigger open area of the dust collector, it's going to be hit with a lot more oxygen and a lot more higher concentration of dust, and it's going to cause an explosion. And so on the inlet of the dust collector, there's a valve that will shut to stop the explosion from going back into the process and endangering any operators. And then on the back side of the dust collector, on one of the sides of the dust collector, it's typically an explosion vent that if an explosion does occur, that vent pops out and it's directed to an area where there's no operators and the risk level is the lowest. And so by putting them inside, we do a little tunnel essentially from the dust collector to the exterior wall. And then when the explosion happens, it'll blow out that explosion panel, and then the fireball would go outside where nobody would be.
That sounds intense.
Yeah. There's some good videos online. Different manufacturers share them of dust collectors doing explosion analysis, and those are always fun to watch.
It's not too many of these conversations I get to hear the word fireball. So
yeah.
Here's to keeping things safe. And we've talked a lot about like standards over the course of our conversation, and brewers are very familiar with OSHA, but how do they make sure they're ensuring compliance with OSHA, the NFPA for the dust safety standards that you're talking about?
Yeah, the best way is to work with the local authority having jurisdiction is what they call it. So the local municipalities that are determining what the designation of the room is and what the permits of the new system are. It's working hand in hand with them to be able to accurately determine what's necessary so that you're not spending excess amounts of money on, explosion proof equipment when you don't need to. A lot of times working with them, and we've helped brewers work with their local authorities, and basically you can save a lot of costs by summarizing the basic needs that you need with the dust collection rather than going to the moon and back with all the extras that could or could not be needed. And because you can do chemical isolation for explosions, and once you get into that world, it becomes extremely expensive. And a lot of breweries want to keep the area clean and keep it maintained, but they don't want to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so working with us and working with the local authorities to determine exactly what they need to be able to not designate it as an explosion area, but still maintain, a clean area is the best way for them to go about maintaining the NFPA standards.
Well, you've set me up for something that I'm interested in. We talk about the cost for all this. So what is the cost involved in, first off, installing a dust collection system at a brewery, but also the maintenance that you have to do yearly? What do those two investments look like?
Yeah, it depends on the amount of pickup points that the dust collector has. And so different systems usually have different amounts of pickup points, and it depends on how many ingredients or how much bulk storage that a brewer has typically. And so a brewer with a couple silos and maybe a bulk bag unloader, the cost would be more on the 10 to 20K range. But if you have a bigger brewery with, say 5 or 6 bulk bag unloaders and 4 or 5 silos, and then a couple bag dump stations that we need to pick up dust from all those sources, then the collector has to increase in size to handle that amount of airflow and the amount of dust generated from those sources. So then you're looking more in the 30 to 40K range. So it depends on the size of the brewery, but typically 10 to 40,000.
And what about like the yearly maintenance?
Oh yeah, the yearly maintenance is relatively low compared to the initial cost. It's only about 100, $200 a year, and most of that is just cleaning the bags, and then just checking out the equipment, making sure everything's still functional and in operation correctly. But much cheaper than the initial cost.
No, that's good to know. So, how does someone calculate the airflow requirements for a dust collection system in their brewery?
Yeah, it depends on the number of pickup points and then the airflow requirements of the different pieces of equipment. Typically, a lot of times you'll see 2 to 4 inch pickup points, 2 to 4 inch diameter pickup points from like bag dump stations or bulk bag unloaders. And that just has to do with how much grain is being dumped into those sources, how much air displaces, and how much dust comes up from that displaced grain, essentially. And so the best way to do that is to work with, like ABM, or work with a company that can determine how many pickup points you have, what sizes those need to be, and then we'll do some quick calculations, figure out how much airflow each one should have to get back to the dust collector without having dust settle out in the ductwork. Because if you have too many pickup points and too small of a collector, what'll happen is that the dust will actually not make it all the way back to the collector, and you'll have a bunch of dust hung up in the ducting from the source to the collector. And then eventually the efficiency just goes down and down. So working with, like a company like ABM to be able to do that is the best way to determine how much total airflow you need based on the system you have.
Awesome. Thanks, Alex. Now, someone asked this question: how can I address dust buildup in milling systems?
Yeah. The best way also is to balance the system. And so usually, after initial balancing, we'll work with the breweries. They'll run it a couple times, or if 2 or 3 times, and we'll figure out their typical batch load through a mill. And so then we can really dial in how much airflow is picking up from the mill, to where we only get the dust generated from it, but aren't sucking good product away as it's milling, essentially. And so working with them, not only on startup, but after a few different recipes, because a lot of times it'll be similar batch sizes. And so working with them to balance the system is how the best way to address that with the mill.
And just looking back at these systems, how long does one typically last? And any tips and tricks? I mean, you talked a lot about maintenance today, but for extending the life?
Yeah. The best way to extend the life is really just maintaining the bags. It's always good to have a company like ABM come out and just make sure all the equipment's running correctly every year or two, kind of thing, and just take a look, make sure all the sensors are still working as they're supposed to. And if that's done, then I've seen collectors in service for 20 plus years. Maintaining them correctly, they can basically go indefinitely. Another big one is just when you don't maintain the bags, like it'll affect the fan, and then good product goes through the dust collector, through the filter media, and then can unbalance those fans. And then if you have to rebalance the fans, it becomes more expensive at that point. And so, but if you do all your maintenance, then there's no problems, and you can have those fans and those collectors and systems you run in 20 plus years, no problem.
How often do you get to go check on these systems?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I go about, I would say, once or twice a year to different systems, depending on the customers. We have a bigger team at the company, so it's not only me, but a lot of the times we'll just check, make sure their bags aren't plugged, that the air pressure differential between the clean and dirty sides are where they need to be. and then just make sure the sensors are working, make sure that they're balanced at the different pickup points and sucking the right amount of air that they need, and not causing suction from too much at one source and not enough at the other. And so it's little things like that that we can help increase efficiency. But me personally, usually about 1 or 2 a year. But yeah, no, we have a little engineering team that can help tackle those needs for customers as they come up.
Neat. So another question just came through. It says, can I retrofit my existing dust collection system with more efficient components?
Yeah, you can. Yeah, a lot of times we'll have brewers come out or contact us and ask us about retrofitting in a collector. Either they bought from someone else or picked up locally, and we've helped them be able to use that collector for their system that they have. So it's not impossible. Usually, if an existing collector, it'll have a predetermined amount of suction that it can have, essentially. So if their system allows that amount of suction to be used. So essentially, if they have a system sized accordingly to that collector, then we can utilize it and add drops as necessary. Sometimes with that, though, you'll have they'll pick up a collector that's too small for the amount of pickup points that they want to have. So if they are a bigger brewery and expanding and have a smaller collector, and they go up to 5 or 6 pickup points and the collector was only doing 1, then you'd have to go into looking at a new one sized correctly for those systems. And if you try to retrofit it, then you're just not getting the suction you need and not mitigating that dust concentration in the air like you want to be doing with a rightly sized dust collector.
Good info there. And this is one I always like to ask, no matter really what topic we're diving into. What are some of the common mistakes, Alex, that you see to avoid when designing or installing a dust collection system at a brewery?
Yeah, I think the most common mistake I see is even with customers that buy new dust collectors is that they will have a dust collector that's built and designed for, let's say, 4 or 5 pickup points, and then they'll add in 5 or 6 more pickup points, and then try to take off of the main dust collection trunk line and pick up from all their new points. And it is possible, depending on the distance away from the collector and how many pickups they want to add. But if you just start going into that trunk line and adding more drops and not adding them correctly with like soft radius elbows and things like that, then the pressure losses that you get through the dust collection ducting are very significant. And basically what that means is that the dust won't reach the collector correctly, and then you'll have very low suction across all your pickup points by trying to add in a couple. So that's the biggest mistake I see, is just trying to willy-nilly cut into the dust collection and add more drops, because looking at the collectors and the trunk lines, it'll often seem like, oh, why not just add in a pickup point? But depending on the distance away and the airflow you need, it's not as simple as that.
No, that's good insight for there. Now, I noticed that you've released 2 dust collection models for the space, but only 2. How do those 2 work for the entire industry?
Yeah, so one of them is a smaller dust collector, and it's smaller and more for like 1 to 3 sources, or silos or bulk bag and loaders kind of thing. And so if you have a low amount of pickup points, you don't need a lot of dust collection, but you need some to get around the NFPA requirements and just keep the space clean for the operators and the environment, then that small one's a great option. And with that small one of the biggest benefits is that since the volume of that dust collector is so much smaller with the small dust collector, then an explosion vent isn't necessary, because the dust concentration inside that collector isn't going to be high enough risk to explode and cause serious injury. And so with that, that's one of the models. And then the bigger one is that one's round. The bigger one is square or rectangular, and that one can be sized up from I'd say about 8 bags all the way to like 96 bags, depending on how big of a brewery you have. So while the small one works great for people that are just getting into dust collection, don't have a big operation. And then the second one, that model is configurable depending on the system size. And so we can size it up from 8 bags to 96 bags kind of thing, and make it as big as we need to be able to handle all the dust from anywhere from 5 to 6 sources to 10 to 20 sources kind of thing.
Okay, so I'm curious now. Why is the smaller unit circular but the larger unit square?
Yeah, and that has to do with the amount of volume inside of it. So the round one has less volume than the square one, and so you don't need that explosion mitigation on the round one, and so it just increases the efficiency. It decreases the amount of overall cost that the brewer will need to make initially. And then the larger square one can handle more airflow, and so if you have more pickup points that are further away from the dust collector, you can get a bigger fan on it, get more air coming through the dust collector, through the bags, and be able to mitigate that dust much better than the small one. But with that, you have to add in the explosion panels and be able to mitigate the explosions risk, essentially. And so basically, the small circular one for small systems, few pickup points are relatively close by. And then the big, larger square ones are for bigger systems where, 10 sources kind of thing that you have to mitigate dust from. And they could be, as far away as like 100 feet away from the collector, 200 feet away from the collector, and still be able to pull enough suction to where they get the correct amount of dust mitigation and keep that environment clean.
Good insight the past 30 minutes, Alex. Now, as we've talked a lot about everything in the umbrella of Dust Collection 101, is there anything that we missed or something you'd like to go back and touch on?
I think we covered a lot of it. Really, I think one of the biggest things is just keeping the biggest thing you can do to help, or the biggest thing a brewer can do to help themselves before dust collection is just having a properly designed system that maintains the dust as much as possible, having closed mills, closed loop systems. And then once that occurs, then dust collection is a great little bonus on there to be able to just keep everything as clean as possible. If you have a bunch of open sources, the dust collection will definitely help, but it's not going to be able to capture 100% of all the dust. So design the system correctly, it can capture 100% of the dust. And so that's just the biggest thing probably to keep in mind as brewers are looking into dust collection, is making sure that their system is, as optimal as it can be to make that collector as efficient as possible.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Alex. And for anyone interested in learning more, you can go to ABM, the letters ABM, equipment.com. Alex, I appreciate you. It's been fun learning about dust collection today, and have an awesome day, and we'll see you soon. Cheers.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Have a great one.